Hello, everyone. I've been here before. I think some of you probably recognize me. From S&P Global, I'm an Associate General Counsel, and I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Platts as well. As Martina said earlier, we've kind of been doing this once a year for a few years. Since last year, from my move 18 months ago from New York to London, I can tell you that in my home, or my adopted home, nothing much has changed in the last year. Everything's pretty much the same. But I'm not here to talk about the wisdom of universal suffrage. I'm here to talk about benchmarks. So I'll do that now. We are talking about the RTS here. As Joe, my colleague, talked about earlier, we both represent our corporation, but we split duties nowadays between the S&P Dow Jones Index business, which Joe looks after, and the Platts business, which I look after, which is a commodity benchmark provider. Moving right into some of the issues that we see outstanding with the RTS, we can go through those in the order that they've been presented, but I'd also like to make some general remarks, which I think one of the things that we would really appreciate is greater certainty in the RTS as to which RTS apply to which specific provisions, because which types of benchmarks, because a lot of those RTS wouldn't apply, particularly in the context of Article 19 benchmarks, but it's not entirely clear to an outside reader how that all operates. So that's one thing we would appreciate is some additional clarity as to how each of the RTS applies to each category of benchmarks. And we also think that a lot of the issues related to definitions in the benchmarks regulation, regulated data, readily available data, would be done well in the delegated acts, but as we've talked about here several times, clarifying recitals in the RTS would also be quite helpful. This is long, but what it mainly says is that we actually do appreciate the approach that's been taken throughout the legislative process here, that there is a proportionate response. We recognize it. ESMA has also, in its consultation paper and in its work, taken heed of that proportionate response. And we, if we look at Article 19 benchmarks, commodity benchmarks, which have a separate regime, there are instances in which we at least need to foresee the possibility that we wouldn't have that regime available to us. And so some of my comments will actually relate to things that aren't applicable to commodity benchmarks, but nevertheless we're looking at closely, both as a corporation and specifically at Platts, to ensure that even though, even in the event that we have to deal with those provisions, we'll be prepared. As mentioned, as Rodrigo mentioned, there is in the oversight function the ability to take multiple committees. That's how it works at index providers, at benchmark providers. Most of the time you have an amalgam of committees which actually make up the oversight function. So you'll have a methodology committee or an analytical committee, you'll have another oversight committee, you'll have compliance people, and all of those people together make up the oversight function. As many have mentioned, including Jamie and Joe, as a benchmark provider, we have fully engaged in the IOSCO process and have done so. I'll just point out to both of them, though, that the oil PRA principles were the first ones done. So we actually did those they were disseminated in October 2012, and we went through that process in 2013 and did our first oil PRA review under the IOSCO PRA principles in the fall of 2013. But that function, it really does work in quite a similar way. We think it works well. There are certain issues, for instance, in this bullet point here, as I said, if there are certain contributions and we were subject to Title II, you might have issues with contributors being part of oversight functions. That's very difficult, and we think could actually create conflicts of interest rather than diminish them. And we also think that while appropriate during our market consultations, which are public, we go out to the marketplace. You could have observers in the oversight function, but it must be, in our view, at the discretion of the benchmark administrator, because again, if you have the ability for contributors or market participants to actually have the final say, the editorial discretion in terms of the benchmark provision, you could run into some serious problems there in terms of administration as well. In the last bullet point here, I'll just say that the oversight committee meeting decisions, it talks about them being published. We would just caution that there are certain instances where confidential information is discussed, et cetera, and we don't think they should be published in the traditional sense of the word. Input data, again, lots of words. I will go through this one fairly quickly because I want to talk about benchmark statements a lot, but if we look at the administrator's role traditionally, we are responsible for the input data. We've always taken responsibility for it. It's part of our role. And we would just note that in terms of verifiability, this has been talked about by several of the participants so far. You know, certain types of information, readily available data, are not contributions. And we think there are other mechanisms for ensuring that the data are robust. And we would just say that if some of the definitions could be further elucidated, that would be helpful because in those instances, we don't see that they have the same risks associated with them, and the risks are more similar to regulated data. Data hierarchy, I'll just say, doesn't always work, and so the flexibility there is very important. Strict data hierarchies don't work, particularly in commodity markets, particularly in illiquid markets. You can have some problems with having a strict adherence to a data hierarchy. And formal checks, again, particularly from data that's coming from outside of the EU and outside of jurisdictions that would be subject to this regulation. Formal checks could be something that's not really possible because we're interacting with a range of entities from a range of jurisdictions, and so that becomes quite difficult too. And a couple of other points, a lot of times we won't have relevant communications. That's very difficult to obtain. And the front office contributions, again, for input data, again, with the caveat that this doesn't apply to commodity benchmarks. In that case, during the IOSCO process, just to mention, we went through a whole discussion about the point about front office contributions, and there was a recognition that that could actually diminish the number of contributors that we had in the data available to us, and that does not appear in the final IOSCO PRA principles. Transparency of methodology, I'll go through this one quickly. We do publish our methodologies. We do take great care in the process, and so it's really about what's in the methodology statement as opposed to the obligation to disclose it as far as we're concerned. ESMA appropriately recognized that that transparency requirements and methodology requirements could vary. In terms of changes to methodology, we do public consultations. We always have published the results of those consultations. The one thing that we would ask is that sometimes it's not appropriate to have all of the responses published in total, and so we would like to be able to do it in summary or aggregated form, and exercise judgment if there's something that's truly irrelevant or off topic. And again, in terms of publication, we would keep all of the responses, but not necessarily make them public. But we would keep them and they'd be available to the NCA as appropriate. Code of conduct. The code of conduct, again, is not applicable to Article 19 benchmarks, but one of the main things about the code of conduct is that if it were to apply to commodity benchmarks, you could actually end up with less transparency because you'd have fewer contributions. And we think the same is true of data that's readily available because it should be treated like regulated data in our mind and not have a code of conduct imposed on it. And so that is the same note that we talked about in the other context. Sorry, I'm a little warm. Exemptions for significant benchmarks. The key point here is that there are a lot of exemptions for significant benchmarks, but an NCA being able to apply these differently in different jurisdictions could result in having those applied in an inconsistent way, and so you could have NCAs in one jurisdiction requiring additional obligations, and that would be consistent across the EU. Now, if I've gotten that wrong, let me know, but it seems like that could actually happen, and you wouldn't want one NCA saying, well, no, now you have to have operational separation, and then another one not in that context. And so some clarity and some consistency there would be very helpful. I wanted to sneak this in. I'm not talking about the DAs, but I did want to talk about the fallback provisions and measuring thresholds. A lot of you, it hasn't really been talked about, but there's a minimum threshold for commodity benchmarks of 100 million euros, and under that threshold. So we are in the moment trying to figure out what the thresholds are for various benchmarks, et cetera. I can tell you from the experience that we're going through right now, that is a difficult task. I know a lot of you in the room have tried to undertake that task. It is not easy. And as Jamie mentioned in her presentation, the fallback provision from current experience, I think should be the way it happens. It's very important to have that. We do have access, we do have better access to that type of data. We can figure out what the open interest is in most circumstances. Another thing you have to understand is that the licensing models don't always, it's not just that we don't have the data or can't get it or whatever. The actual licensing models for some index providers don't provide for that type of clarity. And it's hard to roll over all those licenses to various exchanges, et cetera, around the world in order to get the type of information. So that fallback provision in our mind is actually very, very important to keep. Benchmark statements. So the benchmark statements, in my mind, again, this is something that's happening right now. We're trying to take what we have in our methodology documents, what we have in our assessment rationales, and look at what's required for a benchmark statement. And there is a lot that we feel is required in benchmark statements beyond what might be necessary. So for instance, it's difficult to ascertain the size of the measured market, potential participants, and barriers to market access. That's macro information that's very, very hard to obtain if you're a benchmark administrator. And then where feasible, it talks about the measured market needed to publish a benchmark. That depends on market activity. It requires ongoing discretion. In the commodity benchmark space, there is, we are measuring some illiquid markets, and so the minimum size isn't something that's static. It's not something that you can just kind of put out in a benchmark statement and say, this is the minimum size, this is the number of transactions, or this is the number of bids and offers we would expect. It can vary. Sometimes we extrapolate from other data, we look at other markets, et cetera. So it's very difficult to put that into some sort of static form. And that also raises the question, which we have, about the frequency of the publication of the benchmark statement. The regulation talks about the parameters for when you need to change it, but we're still unclear as to what the cadence is for publication of the benchmark statement beyond the initial preparation of the benchmark statement. And it's hard to figure out how those two will interact, how often you have to publish. I will say it's not feasible to do it with each dissemination of the benchmark. I'm going to try to go a little faster. We have the supervised entity issue is a real one. There are a couple of, I'll be a little bit off script here, but there are a couple of main points about it. One, it's really important that we're able to publish the outcome of that investigation in some sort of aggregated form for a couple of reasons. One, our contributors, depending on the type of assessment that we're doing, we have survey methodologies, we have what we call our market on close methodology, we have index methodologies. A lot of times those contributors in certain instances are confidential sources. US natural gas is a good example, but there are other examples. And some of them may be supervised entities, some of them may not be, but if there's a significant amount of detail in that analysis, it could breach confidentiality concerns. And then the second piece is that we would argue that we should really only have to explain why or why not the benchmark is based primarily on supervised contributions from supervised entities in order to qualify as an Article 19 benchmark. Am I over?
Yeah.
Okay. So I should have done my stopwatch. For authorization and registration, we think there's a lot of information that's required, and a lot of the information goes beyond what's required by the level 1 text. And a lot of that information is detailed, and we think it's a little bit unfair to impose obligations that don't actually aren't part of the Article 19 commodity benchmark regime in the benchmark statement, because we're actually now providing information that's not required by the level 1 text. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.